I'm Ron Paul. I'm a congressman from Texas, serving in my 10th term. I am the champion of the Constitution.
Why do you think America is so dumb? Was it always dumb?
I hope not all of us.
No, not all of us.
We're Americans.
Yes, right. But how do you get this smart? I mean, come on. I mean, if America was a smarter country, wouldn't you be leading in the polls?
Let's hope so.
Because, you know, I watched the Republican debate, and I saw this guy, Ron Paul, who has no chance of winning it, and therefore he was very honest, and he's my new hero. And he spoke real truth about the war on terror, about 9/11, about Iraq. He said, you know what? They hate us because we're over there. They don't hate us because of our freedom or any of those stupid slogans that the Bush people put out. And I'm just wondering why a Democrat isn't saying things like that. Say a Democrat who could use a bump in the polls.
Terrorism is a tactic. You can't have a war against a tactic. It's deliberately vague and non-definable in order to justify and permit perpetual war anywhere and under any circumstances. Don't forget, the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with any terrorist attack against us, including that on 9/11.
Congressman Paul, I believe you are the only man on the stage who opposes the war in Iraq, who would bring the troops home as quickly as almost immediately, sir. Are you out of step with your party? Is your party out of step with the rest of the world? If either of those is the case, why are you seeking its nomination?
Well, I think the party has lost its way because the conservative wing of the Republican Party always advocated a non-interventionist foreign policy. Senator Robert Taft didn't even want to be in NATO. George Bush won the election in year 2000 campaigning on a humble foreign policy. No nation building, no policing of the world. Republicans were elected to end the Korean War. The Republicans were elected to end the Vietnam War. There's a strong tradition of being anti-war in the Republican Party. It is the constitutional position. It is the advice of the founders to follow a non-interventionist foreign policy. Stay out of entangling alliances. Be friends with countries. Negotiate and talk with them and trade with them. Just think of the tremendous improvement relationships with Vietnam. We lost 60,000 men. We came home in defeat. Now we go over there and invest in Vietnam. So there's a lot of merit to the advice of the founders and following the Constitution. And my argument is that we shouldn't go to war so carelessly. When we do, the wars don't end. Have you ever read about the reasons they attacked us? They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years. We've been in the Middle East. I think Reagan was right. We don't understand the irrationality of Middle Eastern politics. So right now we're building an embassy in Iraq that's bigger than the Vatican. We're building 14 permanent bases. What would we say here if China was doing this in our country or in the Gulf of Mexico? We would be objecting. We need to look at what we do from the perspective of what would happen if somebody else did it to us.
Are you suggesting we invited the 9/11 attack, sir?
I'm suggesting that we listen to the people who attacked us and the reason they did it. And they are delighted that we're over there because Osama bin Laden has said, I am glad you're over on our sand because we can target you so much easier. They have already now, since that time, have killed 3,400 of our men, and I don't think it was necessary.
It's an extraordinary statement as someone who lived through the attack of September 11, that we invited the attack because we were attacking Iraq. I don't think I've ever heard that before, and I've heard some pretty absurd explanations for September 11.
Well, if you're talking about 9/11, I mean, 9/11 to me was an unprovoked attack on the United States. And I would disagree with Ron Paul on the assumption somehow that we provoked that decision by Al-Qaeda to hit us in New York.
Excuse me, Senator, but that's just what the Republicans did to Ron Paul in the debate. They twisted what he said. He wasn't saying that we were asking for it. What he was saying was we should listen to our enemies, and maybe the reason they're mad at us is because we have been meddling in the Middle East. We were in Saudi Arabia. That's what bin Laden was mad at us for. Now we're in Iraq, and we're screwing up that country. Maybe if we listen to them instead of just saying we're always the good people, we would actually make ourselves safer. I mean, with all due respect, what do you have to lose?
I want to go back to this exchange you had with Mayor Giuliani here for just a second. Are you suggesting the United States of America caused the attack on 9/11?
No, I think that's a cop-out. When people imply that, what you're saying is that if you don't endorse my foreign policy, you're un-American, you're unpatriotic.
I never said anything like that. I don't say it. You're suggesting.
No, but I think that was the point in the debate, that if I didn't endorse this foreign policy, you turn it around, or he turned it around.
I'm not saying that, but what specifically then are you saying? Are you suggesting that our policies are causing the hatred of people that would cause them to want to kill us?
I think it contributes significantly to it, and this is exactly what our CIA tells us. And anybody who's done any research on this has found out.
What have we done to cause the attack? What did America do to cause the attack on 9/11?
Okay, the Americans didn't do anything to cause it, but policies over many years caused and elicited hatred toward us, so somebody was willing to commit suicide. For instance, the occupation with our military troops on their holy land in Saudi Arabia, bombing a Muslim country for 10 years, putting on sanctions that killed hundreds of thousands of people. So that caused an anger.
Are you saying then that if the world has no moral obligation in the first Gulf War, when an innocent country is being pillaged and people are being raped and murdered and slaughtered, or in the case of Saddam, he's gassing his own people, are you suggesting we have no moral obligation? No, you stand by and let that immorality happen?
We have on numerous occasions.
You support that?
We have on numerous occasions. If we feel strongly about it, why don't we declare?
If a woman is being raped next door, we just do nothing there either?
We're just out of time, but the fact is the Reagan administration stood by while the Kurds were being gassed. It happened in 1988. We didn't do anything about it for how many years?
What did we do with Moscow? What did we do with time? We stood by, and they did it to their people.
We got to run.
You would stand by and do that. I would not. No, I think that's immoral.
Well, would you have the courtesy to ask the Congress to declare war? Would you follow the Constitution?
We did declare war. The authorization, use of force,
we got to run.
There's no place in the Constitution that says specifically.
We got to run, guys. The Kurds were gassed, and we stood by for years until
we gave them the gas. We gave them the gas.
We're not responsible for what happened on 9/11.
They're going to keep debating. We're on the other side of the debate. Keep texting us your vote to 36988.
Anyway, let's go to Back to our busy telephones here. We got Mitzi is in Wisconsin. Mitzi, hi.
Hi, Mr. Hannity. I was calling to let you know that I agree completely with everything you've said regarding amnesty today and the rule of law. However, that only makes me all the more confused as to why it is you're smearing Ron Paul and trying to silence him.
I'm not trying to silence Ron Paul. I put him on Hannity and Combs after the debate the other night. We just had a disagreement. I find his remarks offensive. I find him totally and completely outrageous and wrong. I think he's ill-informed. You know, look, there's a lot of... Look, here's what he said.
They attack us because we've been over there. We've been bombing Iraq for 10 years.
I'm sorry. I find his analysis naive, frankly ill-informed, and ridiculous. So I'm not trying to silence him. I put him on TV that night.
Well, his comments come directly from the CIA's own comments in the 9/11 Commission report.
Listen. You go believe whatever conspiracy you want. I'm not gonna sit here and waste time on the air arguing it. If you believe that, let me tell you something. You got to understand, this enemy's coming here. They have dedicated their lives to destroying us. And if you don't get that, and Ron Paul doesn't get it, I just gently disagree.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
Special interests and the demented philosophy of conquest have driven most wars throughout all of history. Rarely has the cause of liberty, as it was in our own revolution, been the driving force. In recent decades, our policies have been driven by neoconservative empire radicalism, profiteering in the military-industrial complex, misplaced do-good internationalism, mercantilistic notions regarding the need to control natural resources, and blind loyalty to various governments in the Middle East. For all the misinformation given the American people to justify our invasion, such as our need for national security, enforcing UN resolutions, removing a dictator, establishing a democracy, protecting our oil, the argument has been reduced to this: if we leave now, Iraq will be left in a mess, implying the implausible, that if we stay, it won't be a mess.
Ah, all right. Now, I understand that there is a presidential candidates forum that the Iowans for Tax Relief and the Iowa Christian Alliance are putting together. They've invited Republican candidates to appear. All the Republican candidates have been invited except your candidate.
Yes, we found that out the other day kind of by mistake, but we were getting some phone calls. We were getting some phone calls from Iowa supporters of Dr. Paul, and they asked why we weren't on the schedule. and come to find out we didn't even know about the event, so we shuffled around to try to inquire about it. And Lou Moore, our campaign chairman here, did make some phone calls, and we were told that Dr. Paul was not going to be invited. He wasn't invited. He wasn't going to be able to participate, and we were simply shut down. So that was bad news for us.
Right back to Conversation. Michelson here with you. We're on our Newsmaker line. Kent Snyder is with the Ron Paul for President campaign, and he's wondering why his candidate's been excluded from an upcoming presidential candidate forum sponsored by Iowans for Tax Relief and the Iowa Christian Alliance. Ed Fahler represents the Iowans for Tax Relief, and Ed, we'd be curious about the exclusion, sir.
Sure. Well, I'm the executive vice president of Iowans for Tax Relief. I wasn't sure what title you gave me. I didn't want to assume one that I don't have.
Okay.
Months ago, when you start planning something of this scope, we sat down and we made a determination of, what would be in the best interest of our members. We, as 501c3s and C4s, we invited Democrats and Republicans alike. You operate on the assumption there's a potential that all could say yes. So you move forward and saying, what can we, handle in a day? And so therefore we had to draw a line of viability, because we could not, every person who's claimed that they're a candidate for president, we could not include. We set a certain line of viability so we could manage the event, and made our decision months ago and invited who we were going to invite, who we thought would serve our memberships within Iowa, their interests in hearing from the most credible candidates for president.
That's so if Senator McCain says, "Hey, I'd like to come tomorrow," you'd say no? Or if Senator Hillary says that she'd like to come and talk to you guys, you'd say no?
No, then you didn't understand me. I said we invited them.
Well, if they change their mind, would you say no?
If they, that's hypothetical. We would have a discussion about it, but that would still be someone we invited saying that they were interested in coming.
Texting your votes. Who do you think was the winner of tonight's debate? Just text your vote to 36988. By the way, here's a look at the early results of our text message poll. In first place, Ron Paul, surprisingly, 30%.
We have allowed our nation to be overtaxed and overregulated and overrun by bureaucrats. The founders would be ashamed of us for what we're putting up with. We have a very unfair tax system. We need a fair tax system. That means getting rid of the IRS and repealing the 16th Amendment. A strong national defense means that we have an understanding of national sovereignty. That is slipping away from us today. The neoconservatives have taken over for the traditional conservatives, and they do not have the respect for our national borders that they should. we do not any longer have national sovereignty. We have referred too much to the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO, the NAFTA and the CAFTA agreements, and they should not be part of our system. We have a chance to do something this campaign and in this election. We can continue the way we've been going, accumulate more and more big government, assume that the people won't take care of themselves, but it's coming to an end. We have financed the warfare state and the welfare state by overtaxing, over-borrowing, and then we resort to printing money, which is destroying our monetary system. The financial markets today are very shaky. A lot of people don't understand what's happening, but there has been predictions of this. It was well known. Bubbles are created by the Federal Reserve System, and to tell you the truth, the Constitution doesn't provide for a central national bank, doesn't even provide for a Federal Reserve System. It was never meant that the politicians could spend at will, and then if they come up short, they merely print the money. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. No wonder why we have this huge runaway government. We now have a national debt of $9 trillion. We have entitlements of $70 trillion, and we're dumping on the laps of these young people who are upset about what we're giving them, and we need to change it. Now, we got into this mess because we get a bunch of politicians in Washington that like to be reelected and they like power. So therefore they say, what do you need? You need stuff here, there, whatever. And the politicians gives it to them and they get reelected. Now, there's something happening now. It's not going to play anymore because the country is going bankrupt. We don't have the facility to do it. Our good jobs have gone overseas. We can't run the war and we can't run our domestic spending without borrowing $2.5 billion every single day, most of it coming from, unbelievably, the Chinese. This has to change. But it cannot change without a reassessment of what we believe in. Do we believe in the Constitution? Do we believe that we should have the rule of law? Do we believe that sound money ought to be gold and silver and not printed money out of thin air? Congress, in essence, has ceded total control of the value of our money to a secretive central bank. Congress created the Federal Reserve, yet it had no constitutional authority to do so. We forget that those powers not explicitly granted to the Congress by the Constitution are inherently denied to the Congress, and thus the authority to establish a central bank was never given. Of course, Jefferson and Hamilton had that debate early on, and the debate seemingly was settled in 1913. But transparency and oversight are something else, and they're worth considering. Congress, although not by law, essentially has given up all its oversight responsibilities over the Fed. There are no true audits. Congress knows nothing of the conversations, the plans, and the action taken in concert with other central banks. We get less and less information regarding the money supply each year, especially now that we don't even have access to M3 statistics. The role the Fed plays in the President's secretive working group on financial markets goes essentially unnoticed by Congress. The Federal Reserve shows no willingness to inform Congress voluntarily about how often the working group meets, what action it takes that affects the financial markets, or why it takes these actions. But all these actions directed by the Federal Reserve alter the purchasing power of our money. And that purchasing power is always reduced. The dollar today is worth only 4 cents compared to the dollar that the Federal Reserve started with in 1913. This has significant consequences on our economy and our political stability. All paper currencies are vulnerable to collapse, and history is replete with examples of great suffering caused by these collapses, especially to the nation's poor and the middle class. This can lead to political turmoil as well. Even before a currency collapses, the damage done by a fiat system is significant. Our monetary system insidiously transfers wealth from the poor and the middle class to the privileged rich. Wages never keep up with profits on Wall Street and the banks, thus sowing the seeds of class and discontent. When economic trouble hits, free markets and free trade are often blamed, while the harmful effects of a fiat monetary system are ignored.
Congressman Paul, Pete from Rochester Hills, Michigan, wants to ask you this. If you were president, would you work to phase out the IRS?
Immediately.
That's what they call a softball.
And you can only do that if you change our ideas about what the role of government ought to be. If you think the government has to take care of us from cradle to grave, and if you think our government should police the world and spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a foreign policy that we cannot manage, you can't get rid of the IRS. But if you want to lower taxes, and if you want the government to quit printing the money to come up with shortfall and cause all the inflation, you have to change policy.
The Bush administration is pushing and pushing hard. A partnership between the United States and Mexico and Canada with a goal of what it calls integration by 2010. This partnership among three nations is being discussed at the highest levels of the three governments at the urging of the largest multinational corporations. But it is barreling ahead with absolutely no congressional oversight, no voter approval, out of sight completely of the American people, and as far as we can determine, without any constitutional authority whatsoever.
We're coming into a cyclical bottom for gold, and it rises going into December, January, so that might be the reverse of the dollar fall. Apart from that, I think one thing people who are dollar-based need to focus on is the Amero. That's the one thing that nobody's talking about that I think is going to have a big impact on everybody's life in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. If you Google it, you'll find out all about it.
Well, you could tell us a little bit more right now.
You always hear it on CNBC. The Amero is the proposed new currency for the North American community, which is being developed right now between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico to make a borderless community, much like the EU, and the dollar, Canadian dollar, U.S. dollar, and the Mexican peso replaced by the Amero.
You really think that will get any leeway?
You may want to visit a couple of websites and see how far along it is. The Canadians are pretty upset about it, whereas the Americans, apart from the Texans, are the only people who know anything about it. The rest of the public's really sort of with their head in the sand on this one.
We lost more than 23 soldiers this past weekend. How much longer can the insanity continue here without a strategy that provides us with the strategic withdrawal to an over-the-horizon force has been advocated on this floor by colleagues on both sides of the aisle? Why is it that Ron Paul is the only presidential candidate that has the nerve on the Republican side to talk about it without fear of being called unpatriotic or, in fact, booed in an audience? This chamber should be a chamber where we have the opportunity to speak truth to power.
So what we must do is very simply the restoration of law, restoration of the principles of the Founding Father, restore the revolution that once started. Freedom is not something new and strange, and neither is it ancient. It's recent. The ideas of liberty were really introduced to the world through this country. We have been the freest and the most prosperous country in the history of the world. Tyranny is ancient. And unfortunately, this country is returning to tyranny. More and more centralized government and more control. We have lost our way because we've lost our confidence. We believe the government will take care of us. Since 9/11, it is assumed that we cannot be safe without the government. So the federal government, they come in and they register the people, and they want you to have a national ID card, which is the worst thing in the world you can have.
have a lot of goodness in this country, and we should promote it, but never through the barrel of a gun. We should do it by setting good standards, motivating people, and have them want to emulate us. But you can't enforce our goodness like the neocons preach with an armed force.